On the 27th of June, a 17-year-old French boy of Moroccan and Algerian descent was shot and killed by police in Nanterre, a suburb of Paris. Protests immediately erupted, which later escalated into nationwide rioting as demonstrators set cars alight, then destroyed bus stops and shot fireworks at police. The scale of the violence has been blamed on fundamental inequalities across French society. But is inequality really worse in France than elsewhere? Welcome to the programme. I'm Philip Hampshire. Numbers from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development paint a stark picture of how France is integrating its immigrant communities. Compared to equivalent nations such as Germany, the UK or the United States, France appears to be falling badly behind.
These latest riots are being looked at by economists as they try and draw attention to French inequality, particularly for immigrants. Immigrants are more likely to be stopped by the police, face poverty and discrimination in housing. The OECD found over 40% of those who've arrived in the last 10 years live in relative poverty, with more than a quarter never escaping the poverty trap. That's more than double the numbers of native-borns. For comparison, in Germany and the UK, poverty levels between those born in the country and those who've come to the country is less than 2%. One of the drivers of unrest in France is the population's relationship with the police. And the difference for immigrants in France and the UK, for example, is acutely obvious when it comes to police stop and search. In France, black people are 6 times and Arab people 8 times more likely to be stopped by police than their white counterparts, compared to London, where these ethnicities are 2 to 3 times more likely. And encounters with French police are more fatal than in the UK, accounting for 26 fatal police shootings last year compared to 2 in the UK. So why do these differences exist?
Well, for more, I'm joined by Lester Holloway here in the studio with me. He's the editor of The Voice, Britain's only African and Caribbean national newspaper. Meanwhile, in Paris, we have Melissa Chemam, who is a French journalist. And in Lancaster, in northern England, we have Renaud Foucart, who is a senior lecturer in economics at Lancaster University. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining me. Lester, I'm going to start off with you. If we have a look at some of these numbers that have come through from the OECD, they're a little bit horrifying, but you can do a lot of things with statistics. So do you find these numbers credible? Is France really sort of more racist than the United States, more racist than the UK?
Well, I think that it's a bit of a complex picture because when you look at the statistics and it actually shows that the Britain, the UK, is doing so much better when it comes to race equality, particularly in relation to policing. It doesn't feel like that in Britain. Black youth...
It certainly isn't the perception. That's, here in the UK, that Britain's doing better than France.
Well, it's not just about the perception, it's about the reality.
Yeah.
That black youth are 17 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white youth. There's a whole range of statistics which are horrifying. Now, clearly, lethal policing is worse in France. Police tend to carry more guns, and that certainly inflames tensions in communities, and there's a whole range of different factors that feed in to uprisings. But we've had uprisings in Britain before, particularly in 1981 and 1985, and the way that policing is going in Britain, we can't rule out that there will be further trouble unless there is significant reform. So when it comes to the difference between Britain and France, I think one of the key issues is the way in which France sees race, which is a little bit different to Britain, although Britain's heading in that direction, which is trying not to see race despite all the evidence of racial disparities. And that is essentially the blockage, which is blocking the reform that will take out the anger from communities that are very frustrated about the way they're policed and the way they feel and are discriminated against in everyday life.
We'll get back to this and the different aspects to racism shortly, but let me just ask each of you in turn. Melissa, we go to you. How do you feel about these numbers? would you really look at these numbers and go, yes, I feel that that genuinely reflects an accurate picture? France is a much more racist place than, say, living in Germany, Britain, the United States, Italy, and so on.
Well, I would say yes, but not only because of the statistics, but because I myself have lived in the United States and in Britain. I've lived in Britain for about 7 years and in different parts of England. And as a reporter, I reported on the issue very much. I worked on films about racial discriminations, did a lot of research, and I've been writing about it. And as a feeling, I feel much safer as a French person of Algerian descent in England, that's for sure. There's many explanations to that. Then when it comes to core discrimination, when it comes to work, visibility, representation, and social mobility, I do think that France is a bit of a special nutcase. As your journalist said, it's mostly because of rules that France had for many years that we couldn't stigmatize people by asking them to reflect on their race or present themselves as where they come from. They have this idea of universalism and people should feel French and forget about their origins if they are sons of immigrants. But this has created a lack of means to respond to discrimination that comes from religion and race. So definitely, simple answer is I do feel that France is really, really late on these issues. I was in London in 2011 when there was some uprising and protest after the death of Mark Duggan. And I do think that the country has improved the relation between the youth in difficult neighborhood and the police, because they have community police, because the police is not armed. And also France, finally, before I leave the floor to everyone else, has got a very special problem with Algerians due to its history. The colonial era in Algeria was very specific. It was very unique as they considered the territory as a part of France. And the discrimination then was absolutely appalling, one of the worst in the world, comparable to South Africa, I would say. And that has left a lot of consequences in the way the police deals with the youth that comes from North Africa.
Well, Melissa, there's a lot in there. We'll get back to unpack some of that in a second. But Renaud, let me pass this across to you. What's your take on this? Do you really think that France is that much more racist than other countries of a comparable economic level?
Well, of course, unable to speak of personal experience, and I'm fully endorsing what Melissa in particular said about the lack of statistics. So even if you wanted to discuss the issues and a way to improve things, it's very difficult to do so in France, because every time you want to measure the amount of inequality, the amount of social mobility between how different it is for different ethnic groups, you're always facing the same wall, that this is something that is seen as racist in principle in France to collect that kind of data. So no, we know that there is this survey evidence about police stop and search, and we also know that politically it doesn't seem to be interesting for a lot of government to do anything against the requests of the people who are demonstrating against Nanterre in the street. So when they wear the yellow jacket, it was a massive demonstration against the carbon tax. The government did something very costly. The French government decided to go against their initial plan and to cancel part of that. When the youth of France was in the streets to demonstrate against police violence and the killing of Nanterre, the only response seems to have been to have repression. So nobody seemed to take seriously any attempt to improve things. It doesn't seem to be really on the agenda. It's really about showing that the state is strong and doesn't get overwhelmed by dangerous youth.
OK, Lester, let's come back to something you mentioned earlier. It's also been mentioned by Melissa. France has a very different conception of what it means to be French than Britain does about what it means to be British. Is that fundamentally underlying part of this problem? Because the French government refused to even collect racial statistics and data in case that started prejudice on its own.
I think it is. I think you're absolutely right there. But I think that, firstly, Britain is going in the direction of France. Obviously, we do collect more statistics.
First of all, is that a bad thing or a good thing?
Well, it's a bad thing because we've had the last census, so the last population census in 2021 is the last one, unless an incoming government changes that. So we'll have less information about what's going on in society as far as ethnicity, faith and other factors are concerned. We've also got a growing movement which is hitting back at initiatives that are there to combat racial disparities. For example, just in the last few days, there's been, stories about black supplementary schools and the fact that, some people believe they shouldn't exist, the very retrograde views. So I think that we have to be wary about going down the route of France, and I think the uprisings actually are should give people pause for thought. But at the same time, where we do collect statistics in the UK and they don't in France, it doesn't necessarily mean that it goes on, will lead on to government action. So, for example, we know when it comes to employment that the difference between black and white unemployment has really oscillated between twice and 3 times as much in the last 20 years, and there haven't been actions over successive governments. There's been a lack of action to tackle and get to the bottom of those racial disparities. So it's one thing to have statistics, it's another thing to act upon them. And unfortunately, we are yet to see a government in the UK, in the entire history of the country, which is centring the need for equality at the heart of its programme.
Melissa, let me bring this across to you. Given that liberté, égalité, fraternité is literally there on the old coins for France, why is it that the French government has been so bad at this, do you think?
Obviously, the situation for me has changed very deeply in the past 10 years. So there was some sort of like parallel evolution where obviously we've had a growing number of second generation, third generation migrants. They have become a bigger part of the poor population. And at the same time, you had a government that went from strongly social, with a lot more investment in public services than in the rest of Europe, to a completely neoliberal government that doesn't want to spend this money on neighborhoods in France that are considered not fruitful. There's this obsession with the Macron government about reindustrializing France, bringing new tech enterprises. And so they favor neighborhoods and a sort of population that is already kind of well off, doing really well. There's been also a huge change in education. If I take my own example and a lot of examples of people that were from immigrant background, went to state school, local school, the normal free education system until I went into one of the best universities, which is actually the same as Emmanuel Macron, and we were there almost a few years apart. I do believe that it's almost impossible to do now if you come from a banlieue like I do, just because the local state schools have become so bad. The schools classes are crushed with people, and then more and more from poor immigrant background, and their parents sometimes don't even speak French as well. Because when it came to my generation, my parents spoke French because they were the ones that were colonized. They came strictly from an French education, because France has had a very strong policy of making people more French, even in their colonies, than Britain ever had. So obviously with social change, with transformation of the routes of migration, this is harder to do. And there's a bigger despise for these people that arrive that are seen as just strictly useful or strictly useless. While obviously in the 70s and 80s, there was still a policy that was post-colonially playing with some sort of friendliness towards certain countries. And as I said before, the question of Islam, and especially Islam from North Africa, has become really politically used to scare among the population. And so there's no political will, and it's very difficult to recreate it to support this use that is always described as less valuable than the rest of the French population. But it is dangerous.
Well, hold on there. Let me come back to that in a second. Renaud, let me bring this across to you. Do you agree with Melissa that there is less social mobility in France now than there was, say, 20 years ago?
So I think what is important is the perception of mobility, and also the perception of what Melissa said about France is becoming a neoliberal state. So while I agree with a lot of her analysis, on this point, France is a country with more than 50% of GDP of government. France, through the energy crisis, had a national energy provider, as national as it completely today. France is not a very private sector country when you compare it internationally. And maybe that's one of the reasons, actually, that doesn't create all those incentives for mobility. So you talk about, has France a good rate of social mobility? France has a decent rate of social mobility. France has lower inequality in general of outcome than countries like the United States, definitely. But there is maybe a different sense of aspiration. So there is an interesting survey, for instance, about perception of mobility. Americans do believe that it's very likely that if you are poor, you end up being among the top 20% earner. French believe that it's very unlikely. But actually, there is more social mobility in France than in the US. But it's not perceived, but I don't think it's anything to do with the state being too small in France. If anything, France has one of the largest governments you can imagine in the West.
All right, well, I'm going to play you out a clip now, if I can. It's not really a very long clip, it's more of a sound bite, but this particular one comes from France's Europe minister.
There is no systemic racism in France.
Renaud, that was the minister in a very recent interview with the BBC's Hard Talk programme. That's a pretty categorical statement for a place where a large portion of the population is out rioting on the street and burning things, saying that there is... they'd like to disagree with the minister just a little bit.
I think what she said made little sense and is simply a political point. So there are studies about France, a famous one, for instance, about cashiers in French supermarkets, and show that people are largely prejudiced and behave as if they expect others to be prejudiced. So you see that people from minority expect to be treated in general in the labor market relatively badly and act in consequence. So we know that everything that we could measure in France points to the fact that there could be improvements. And if you think about the French government as being supposedly more pro-business than others, there is a lot of productivity that is lost in France just because of those expectations. People from difficult neighborhoods, people who don't have the right skin color or the right religion, are not as productive as they could be. So if you were pro-market, very right-wing person, you should think that systemic racism is a big impediment to growth in France, and you should be fighting toes and nails to have those improvements available. So in my opinion, not only is she wrong, but she's really blocking one very important way for which France could do much better, because it's a very diverse country, a very multicultural country, but that is really blocked by the fact that they refuse to face the fact that there are things that are not working in the labor market, not working in the police, and that block people from trying to do their best in the country.
Let me take this across to Leicester.
Well, I mean, we're experiencing something similar in Britain. A couple of years ago, we had what was called the Sewell Report, which the British government commissioned by Tony Sewell, who's now been made a Conservative peer. And, you know, that was trying to explain away institutional racism, pretty much denying it and saying it's all about class and place. And that was roundly condemned by just about everybody. But yet, you know, the government are still holding firm to that idea. And that idea that basically there isn't institutional racism has been picked up by the police. You know, there's been the chief constable in Greater Manchester and also in London, and the Metropolitan Police are denying the term institutional racism. They're saying it doesn't apply to them, even though they can't prove that it doesn't. And all the evidence will point in the other direction. And the trouble is that, you know, we're going backwards, because it was like 25 years ago we had the Macpherson Report, and then there's the Stephen Lawrence Report, which first introduced the concept of institutional racism. And it's disappointing that 25 years later, we're effectively turning back the clock and denying the very existence of institutional racism. And if we don't stop this trend, you know, that will spread across other institutions. And what that means is that, you know, if you don't recognise institutional racism, then there was no impetus, there was no reason to tackle it or to even look for it. And so we find ourselves in the position of France, where you know, race is an invisible concept, despite the fact that you know, certainly people of colour are far from invisible, even though we have the term invisible minorities. Actually, the case is because of the visibility of race or difference, that brings on discrimination.
Both Melissa and Renaud have brought up their feelings that France is either actually less socially mobile right now, or there's the perception that it's less socially mobile right now. How do you feel that relates to the UK?
Well, Britain has very poor social mobility. Obviously, we've had social mobility commissions in the past from successive governments that have effectively recognised